We are planning a future where we're increasing trip lengths on average at scale that the city hasn't seen before. The public transport system will only be able to do so much. No Olympic city, as far as I'm aware, has had a really positive walking legacy beyond the Games.
Greater Brisbane's transport challenges aren't simply about roads, railways and buses. They're also about where people live, where they work, and whether the network's traditional focus on the inner city reflects the journeys people actually make. In this episode, I sit down with transport engineer and Queensland Walks board member David Hayward. We discuss the relationship between transport and land use planning, why walking is often overlooked, and whether Brisbane 2032 could leave a meaningful active transport legacy. Every aspect of life in Greater Brisbane can be viewed from more than one perspective. In each podcast, I sit down with one person to explore theirs. The views expressed aren't necessarily shared or endorsed by the Brisbane Channel, but they can add another dimension to the wider conversation. This is one perspective, not the final word. You can watch the extended version of the video podcast by becoming a channel member at insider or elite contributor level on the Brisbane Channel. This podcast was made possible by the support of excellent local business YB Painting Services. Here's my conversation with David Hayward. Thanks for joining me here on the Brisbane Channel Podcast, in depth. And I'll just get you to introduce yourself first.
Oh, thanks for the invitation, Adam, to be a part of the great Brizzy Channel. My name is David Hayward. I wear a few hats in the transport planning and engineering industry. Firstly, I'm a director and co-founder of Aptura Consulting, a business that focuses on transport modelling with my partners Matthew Petherick and Harry Wilson, and also an industry advocacy in terms of particularly recently joined the board of Queensland Walks, which is a very good organisation to be a part of to promote better walking across Queensland, and also Engineers Australia's Transport Australia Society, where I'm Queensland branch chair.
And now you're on the board of Queensland Walks, so why pedestrian advocacy?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. The more experience you get, the more you learn as well, and the way cities have evolved, particularly cities like Brisbane, you underestimate the value walking has. Traditionally, a lot of the transport network is planned around cars and public transport. But the more you got involved in these projects through the years, you realise that walking has such a powerful way to make cities more sustainable, vibrant and productive. And I think that was perhaps, I think we have been underdoing how much we could be leveraging walking in moving people through cities and creating great places. So yeah, I was keen to get involved in Queensland Walks to improve the conditions for walking across Queensland, because there's a lot more we can be doing, and with really great outcomes for many people.
So what does the ideal system look like, where all of those needs are considered?
An ideal system, you'd have to, you'd like to go to the SimCity model, to be honest, but that's not really available to us. We have to balance the ideal and reality. I think that's the challenge. I think there's a lot of idealism to what people want cities to be, and there's completely varying degrees and views of what those cities look like. But I think the important thing is to understand what the environment is you have, where your existing infrastructure is, where your land uses are, and how do you leverage those. I think that's the focus moving forward. And certainly the ideal is to improve or increase as much active travel and public transport use as you can. But there's the way our cities have been built and designed and formed, there's limitations to that. But there is certainly improvements we can do, and it's about combining that land use with the infrastructure as best we can, and leveraging those shorter trips. I think if you look at the numbers, which are quite surprising, I think when we do discuss them, there are a lot of short trips across a region like Greater Brisbane or Southeast Queensland that are far more suited to or attractive to car driving, and due to there being a lack of either infrastructure that's safe and convenient for cyclists or pedestrians, and even a lack of public transport service, whether it be a bus service. So I think the best thing we can do moving forward is cultivating those precincts, whether it's a suburban shopping centre, public transport hub. How do we get better housing and education and jobs around those to cultivate those shorter trips that would be more attractive to walking and cycling, and therefore more sustainable for your city to grow as well.
You talked about, what the existing infrastructure is and how the cities have been designed, in the past, impacting on how we then deal with things now. This is something that's come up in a few of the podcasts already. So in terms of Brisbane or even Greater Brisbane, how has in this part of the world that actually impacted on what we can and can't do now?
Oh, there's a significant impact to how much we can do with what's already been formed across Greater Brisbane. It's interestingly, it's obviously a North American-styled city with a inner city sort of central business area, and a lot of the public transport feeds into, in a radial way, feeds into the inner city, and the population has grown obviously exponentially outward with lower densities. So the lower the density and the further people are travelling makes it extremely difficult for public transport service to stack up and for it to be attractive for active travel. So that being said, there is a lot of really good infrastructure in Brisbane that can be leveraged in a really positive way for public and active transport. It's a matter of strategically and tactically making the most of what we have there and transforming it. And it's going to take a nice level of transformation in terms of its land use that is more conducive to public and active transport to get those places better connected and providing better access to services for people that are further away from the inner city.
You've done some research on how we actually do travel around Brisbane. So how is it what are the movements like within the city?
Yeah, the interesting finding, a reason we went down the path of this type of research was it was sort of a light bulb moment on working on projects in Sydney 10 to 15 years ago. And when we were sort of modelling for either light rail or a tunnel, in terms of how do you fit light rail into a congested road network, or how many cars will travel through a tunnel. When we were doing the modelling, we realised, I think we ran a scenario, for example, with the future having autonomous vehicles, and everyone would take an autonomous vehicle to work and then send the car home or send it to take people on other journeys. So therefore there'd be, or even if everyone was working from home, so there'd be no cars travelling into the CBD of Sydney. And we ran the scenario and we learned that it didn't make that much of a difference as what we thought it would. So then we looked at the trip patterns in more depth, very late at night, and we realised there's a lot of short trips across the city, and there was a relatively smaller percentage of people working in the inner city than the rest of Sydney. And then there was a book by Peter Seymour at the same time about the future of Australian cities, which was a bit of a profound moment for us. And then we sort of analysed it in the way that Peter Seymour recognised there's four types of commuters or work trips in terms of their spatial pattern, either being towards the city or away from the city, being the second, a local trip, a short trip within your local area where you live, being the third, and the fourth being circumferential, which is everywhere else. And that highlighted that for a city like Brisbane, approximately 30% of people travel inward towards the city for work, and the rest is around 25% work within their local area, and 5 to 10% travel away from the inner city, and around 35% or so travel around the city. So therefore only around 20% of people work in the inner city. 80% are therefore fighting to get to their work across a very large city like Brisbane. So it makes it harder for ourselves, and that's why, in a way, there's not a fight, but it's working against each other, I guess, the public transport system and actually where people are travelling to go to work. In that the public transport system's geared towards the inner city, but that's only going to capture, at best, 20% of those workers, and 80% the public transport isn't as effective and focused on getting people to other destinations across the city, of which is the majority of work trip movement.
So is that something that should be a focus, is on resolving that?
Yeah, it is. I'd like to think it would be, because it's a really big opportunity. If I could mention, like, there was a really good point I think Tim Mitchell made from RACQ about a big opportunity for Brisbane moving forward is to reform the bus network, for example, and that's a real opportunity, because there's significant demand for people travelling across the city that's not in the inner city. And there's very limited bus services that do that with a high degree of frequency and priority. So if we were to do that, the demand is there. That would actually have a meaningful travel mode shift towards public transport. That's sort of the next step for us, especially now that the fares are 50 cents. So that makes it cost competitive for that local journey, especially with increasing fuel prices recently. So that is the big opportunity, and knowing that those demands are there, I think gives the confidence for planners to know if we do provide that service, people will use it, and it should provide a more efficient and sustainable transport performance for that local area across the city.
I'll just take a quick moment to thank the sponsor of this video, YB Painting Services. The multi-award winning team offer fixed pricing and a 5-year warranty on their work, so you know exactly what you're getting up front. Claim your exclusive 10% discount by scanning the QR code on screen, or if you're listening, you can go to ybpainting.com.au/TBC. I guarantee you won't regret it. Now back to the conversation. And I guess one of the challenges with Greater Brisbane, because it's like this massive, conglomeration of, 5 different LGAs.
Yes, yeah.
And each of those is growing rapidly, particularly Moreton Bay, Ipswich, Logan, they're all really experiencing this massive growth, but and it's kind of, there's not this clear division between each of them. It's kind of functioning as one massive city. So how does that play into things when we're trying to plan and work out how to make things work well?
There's really good discussion in the industry at the moment, particularly because the South East Queensland Regional Plan is being updated again, and there's been a strong call from the LGAs outside of Brisbane or surrounding Brisbane, because they are, in fairness, have a fair position to make and input into the regional plan, in that from the previous 2 regional plans of South East Queensland dating back to 2017 and 2023, Greater Brisbane is planned to grow from approximately 2.5 million in 2021 to close to 4 million in 2046, and approximately 67% of the population growth are in the LGAs outside of Brisbane City Council. Yet at the same time, only around 1/3 of the jobs being added into Brisbane are being located in those LGAs. So therefore, we are planning a future where we're increasing trip lengths on average at scale that the city hasn't seen before. And that's going to present extremely challenging transport problems to resolve and manage. And equally, it doesn't provide equitable access for people that live in those regions to jobs, which I think we should be planning for as a city, ensuring all locations have as equitable access as possible to jobs, education and services. So it is, I wouldn't want to understate it, but it is a very big opportunity to get the shape and structure of the land use in a more sustainable way and an equitable way for the region. So hopefully that is the case over the next 6 months, because there's a lot to be gained for the region moving forward.
So what does that look like? Like what kind of things do we need to consider and focus on to achieve that?
Yeah, it'd be just getting a better balance, for example, of that 67% of population being outside of the 20-kilometre radius effectively. Perhaps if it either be slightly lower, but at least where you have that population growth, you have a higher proportion of job increases. So putting industry and the types of future jobs as well that our cities and country will have as well in those locations. So we're shortening on average the work trips, because on average over the last decade or so they've increased from approximately 15 kilometres on average, the average work trip in Greater Brisbane, to 17 kilometres and probably higher now, because that was around COVID time. So certainly if we're going to plan the population and jobs in that way, those trip lengths are only going to increase, and therefore accessibility is reduced. Public transport's harder to service those areas the further you're away from the city. So yeah, I'd say a good way to measure the success of the next regional plan is to look at that measure at a high level to say, well, are we getting the balance right across Greater Brisbane, across the LGAs in a stronger way?
All right, well, let's shift now to walking and the pedestrian experience in Brisbane. Do you think that walking is perhaps the most overlooked component of transport planning?
It's whether it's the most overlooked, I'd say it probably is, to be fair, on balance. There's a few examples I could provide on that. I won't go into too much technical detail, but for example, if you're looking at an intersection upgrade and you run the analysis of the traffic flows and the performance of that, the analysis you do of the cars is by movement, where you work out how much the cars or vehicles are delayed at the intersection on average across a peak hour. Yet for the pedestrian movements, you don't just measure the movement of whether a person's crossing one leg of the street or two. You do it individually, and so we don't really capture the full delay of the full movement across an intersection. So that's one example where I think the pedestrians are not equitably looked after in how we plan intersection upgrades, for example. It's been about reducing delays to vehicles as much as possible within a certain budget and cramming in as much capacity as you can for the traffic lanes. The other example for pedestrians, I guess, is for a typical development, shopping centre and car park. It's not very welcoming, I guess, in many cases, where historically, if you have a shopping centre or a precinct, there was a plan or policy in years gone by where the car parking had to be visible from the road, so drivers knew that there was car parking to access those shops. And what's that left us with is just a big grey field of car park, and it's not that welcoming for a pedestrian to walk through into that centre from their residence. So I think moving forward, that's an opportunity as well to say, well, how do we make it more welcoming for local suburban shops, for example, for people to walk or roll to those centres instead of having to drive, without being in a hostile environment to navigate your way through can be a very chaotic scene at many sort of suburban car parks as well.
How about e-mobility? What's the role of that, and how is that changing the way we get around our cities?
Yeah, look, from its outset, e-mobility is and still is a wonderful opportunity to better connect where people live to their jobs, or connect people between jobs and recreational activities. And it breaks down the tyranny of distance that a city like Brisbane has. Because it can get you there quicker and more safely if there is good infrastructure, which I think is the challenge that we've sort of got to recently in Brisbane, where it's been identified there's a lot of our network isn't exactly safe for e-mobility and comfortable. Going on a journey on an e-scooter through South Brisbane and West End is quite chaotic, to be fair. It can get you to the destination quicker than walking, for example, but the journey is quite rough. Like the gradients of the pram ramps that go up and into the roads, and having to cross multiple access road driveways makes it a very chaotic journey. So I think it's got a long way to go in terms of the infrastructure to make the most of its full potential. Because when you think about it as well, like connecting, it accelerates us through a city like Brisbane, where the density is lower and traditionally public transport use isn't as strong, and there's less sort of mass rapid transit. The density is often referred to as a way to get better use for public transport. But when you think about it, with e-mobility, it is able to connect those mass rapid transit stations much further out. Maybe 1 or 2 more kilometres is now your catchment instead of 500 metres. So that's, I think, where we need to go to next with e-mobility, is get better infrastructure to connect the residents safely and efficiently to those public transport hubs or suburban centres for conducting your daily activities.
So what kind of infrastructure would that be?
Yeah, it's probably ideally separated, smooth, wide enough paths for that's separate from obviously the traffic lanes for vehicles. So where the other opportunity is obviously as well, though, is through parkways and creeks, and we do have a really good network of those, but it's connecting those really good separated pathways into where schools and shopping centres are and jobs are across suburbia.
So in Brisbane City Council has their tall over sprawl policy, where they're trying to, increase density close to facilities, public transport. Are we kind of getting ahead of ourselves in some areas where they're putting in the density, but the transport infrastructure and facilities maybe aren't actually enough to deal with that just yet?
There's a fair bit to this, and I think it's the recent announcement on that front. It's an interesting one, because when you look back 15 years ago at least now, time's going very quickly, but Brisbane had planned, probably in the regional plan or even the city's plan, for principal activity centres like your Chermside, Mount Gravatt, Indooroopilly, to be connected by busways. So we achieved the southern one, which was great. The next one was to Chermside, and we're still planning that, of course, but it is that chicken and egg exercise where, unfortunately, the brakes stopped on rolling out the busways around 15 years ago. Yet at the same time, Chermside was planned as a principal activity centre, and a lot of units started going up. The height limits were increased. And I sort of feel for the residents and buyers and developers of those multi-unit developments going up around Chermside, because they bought them probably around 15 years ago on the promise of a busway will be there in 5 to 10 years. And that never really eventuated, but the height went there. But in fairness as well, I wouldn't be surprised if the full potential of Chermside's principal activity centre in terms of jobs and health and residential towers has been fulfilled, because the infrastructure didn't come. I think it's a really good case study there of build it and they will come. So yeah, it's an interesting one in terms of height versus sprawl. It's certainly the right concept, but I think there needs to be that commitment in infrastructure to get people building the height that the city desires. And I think Chermside's a great example of that. Like, there's been height limits across other areas of Brisbane that probably haven't been fulfilled because the infrastructure hasn't been able to get there as was planned or hoped.
Covered that. Okay, so let's get to Brisbane's big test, the Olympics. So we're going to have this massive influx of people for a short period of time. Brisbane's aiming for the majority of spectators to reach venues by public and active transport. What kind of demand will that place on the network, and what will it require for that to actually eventuate?
Yeah, it's an impressive task we've presented ourselves. It's one I think transport planners are enjoying and fearing. It's the thing with Brisbane, and what gives me great hope is it's a unique games in a sense that its venues and major venues are located where in the inner city area and where a lot of infrastructure is and where people will travel beyond the games. Historically, many Olympic and Paralympic Games cities have been hosted in compounds isolated from general daily travel and activity, like Homebush in Sydney and other Olympic precincts that have been built into cities. And it's taken Sydney probably a good 25 years to make Homebush fully connected in the way that it was planned and invested in back in the time. So to get Brisbane at that level of public transport and active transport use is a significant leap, of course, and something the transport network has never experienced and may not experience again. The capacity needs to be uplifted across the board, and Cross River Rail is such an important project for that, to move people at mass through the inner city where those major venues will be, and equally extending the rail network effectively up to the Sunshine Coast and with greater speeds and servicing through to the Gold Coast will play a big part. So you have that big spine from end to end, which is great. And the challenge will be, an opportunity, I think, is right there for the taking for active travel, because people will travel public transport to their work or pretty consistently before and after the games, and with the uptake in what new infrastructure is provided. But the big opportunity I see for Brisbane is active travel. And it was great to see, I think on the weekend, Bicycle Queensland initiated a safe and secure bicycle parking compound at the Gabba for the Brisbane Lions game. And that's something we should be embracing more moving through to 2032. And equally for active travel, there's an enormous amount of people not only going as spectators to the venues, but I can imagine the live sites and just wanting to experience being in Brisbane, in the great parts of Brisbane, in the inner city and around the river, either during to watch events or post events, pre-events. So that's another part of the equation, not only spectators, which is the equivalent probably of how many people travel into the city for work every day, going to sporting events. It's the loading on top of that of people wanting to experience just being in Brisbane in a most exciting way that we'll probably ever experience. So yeah, it's the key, like, because no Olympic city, as far as I'm aware, has had a really positive walking legacy beyond the games. But I think Brisbane, the way the venues are planned and the public transport system will only be able to do so much. The rest will be requiring active travel to fill that void, and what can we be doing in terms of new connections, safer, convenient pathways in and around the CBD will be a really big one to possibly make the strongest walking legacy in Olympic Paralympic Games history for a city.
So are there particular links that will be especially important to get right?
Yeah, there will. And there's still got to be a lot of planning done for that, because there's a lot of options on the table, and I think it's going to take a good amount of coordination and planning and thought across levels of government and industry. I think there's a good signal and template there by Planning Institute of Australia, and which we're partly involved in, and Architects Institute of Australia as well, and Landscape Architects as well, in terms of the Green Grid, which you might be familiar with, which I think was fed through the Better Brisbane program. There was a Better Brisbane call out to help shape the best legacies possible for the Brisbane 2032 Games, and there was a combined industry submission around a green grid, so creating strong green pathways for active travel through the CBD and surrounds, and connecting to the venues, but also the key precincts across the city. So deprioritising some car paths in some cases, or just emboldening and enlightening some of the other existing paths that are probably a bit worn down now, but can certainly do with a bit of TLC to make them more attractive and and for people to use.
So those changes that we're talking about, particularly in terms of active transport and walking for the Olympics, is that something that you would see as, you know, mostly temporary, or would that be a lasting legacy for Brisbane?
There will be a combination of both, and it's just about identifying where temporary is needed and wouldn't have much use, because there'll be so many security overlays and temporary infrastructure around the venues that won't be in legacy mode. It's probably identifying those perimeters of each of the venues and identifying what's the level of connectivity like for cyclists and pedestrians, and identifying what is a really effective way to uplift those. And the other aspect too, remembering is we can't forget the nighttime effect. It'll be the shortest daylight hour games in history, and when you think about how the day session works and transitions to the night session, where you potentially have 200,000 people leaving the venues from the day session, but it'll be entering nighttime by then, because it'll be pretty much dark by 5:30 p.m. when the games are held, and there'll be equally 200,000 people going to the events of an evening. So how we control and coordinate and manage those movement of people in darkness as well is a really important one that we should take hold of and really uplift how we illuminate our streets and paths, such that I think that would hopefully be more permanent and help the nighttime economy and help people of all types to experience the city at night in a safe and comfortable and convenient way, which it'd be fair to say there's probably a lot of spots not too far from the inner city that aren't that safe and welcoming for people to walk down of an evening.
What would need to be committed to, like, pretty much now or in the immediate future, to make those kinds of legacy, results actually possible?
A lot's there in terms of the delivery plan. It's about funding and prioritising and allocating the funding in an effective way to those, especially those bigger opportunities where active travel can take the pressure and provide the assurance that people will be able to access the games successfully. There's a lot of moving pieces to planning the games. We don't know exactly what all the sports will be yet and where people will be living during the games. So it's a matter of gearing up, getting the funding right. I think a bit of planning for the funding, but the active travel infrastructure comes into force in that closer to 2 to 3 years out from the games when it gets rolled out. So we've got to, at least for the active transport infrastructure, we do have more time to get the planning right and the delivery right compared to the larger scale infrastructure projects, which take a lot more money and a lot more human resources to get it built.
All right, well, we'll wrap up with a few quick questions, sort of broader questions. But if you were to design Greater Brisbane's transport system from this point forward, what role would each mode of transport play?
The role of each mode of transport. Okay, so I think over time, in terms of car use, it should be prioritised for the longer journeys that are needed to connect people to businesses, schools, and whatnot, and probably deprioritised for CBD travel. Public transport's obviously most suited for the CBD and inner city area, and it's already doing that job, and Cross River Rail will come through with that as well to provide more capacity. The challenge with Cross River Rail, though, quickly is even when it's built, the business case forecast predicted there wouldn't be any change to car trips travelling into the inner city. So we need to be doing more with Cross River Rail to get that greater modal shift of public transport into the inner city, and perhaps active travel infrastructure is a part of that equation. Public transport's obviously, as we've discussed, the opportunity to service those short trips and circumferential trips across Brisbane by providing more frequent and effective bus services with the fleet that we have, I think is a very important piece to creating a better overall transport system and performance for Greater Brisbane. And active travel is predominantly, obviously, those journeys between 1 and 5 kilometres for cyclists and pedestrians, identifying where those trips are across the network and ensuring those areas have very good footpaths and equally cycling paths is a long way to getting our best outcome with what we've got.
Mm-hmm. And what about long-term solutions that would bring the biggest improvement?
Long-term is, I'd like to put it in the urban planner's task. It's the land use planning. I think the biggest changes and potential benefits we can make to the future of Greater Brisbane is getting the better allocation of land use across southeast Queensland, and because that can do the heavy lifting of the mass movements in a much more effective way than having to build the infrastructure. I think there's been enough evidence over the last 60 years that we haven't been able to build our way to the growth that we've delivered in terms of the population and the sprawling areas that we've got. Dating back to Wilbur Smith's transport study in the 1965, where, in fairness, I don't think we've built half of what that road network was planned, and even the public transport network that the Wilbur Smith study had in 1970, I think. Even 20 years ago, the Connecting SEQ plan, I think the future transport network that we planned for 2031, I don't think we'll get to half of that infrastructure and public transport services that was planned back 15 years ago. So, and a part of that is that we've made it so hard for ourselves to connect those sprawling areas to our transport system. So, yeah, I think I only see great benefits to be made for everyone if we get a better allocation of land use across what infrastructure we have and create those vibrant precincts around those, and the transport system will be a big beneficiary.
All right, great. Well, on that note, thanks for joining me. It's been a pleasure.
Absolute pleasure. Pleasure's all mine. Thanks, Adam. Cheers.
All right.